Hello, Dr. Georgie. Welcome to St. Aloysius.
Good
Welcome
evening.
to the group.
Good evening. Thank you.
Good evening. Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Our principal, Dr. Chakojos, has joined us. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Good evening.
This is Dr. Georgie,
Yeah, from
chair of today's
okay,
session.
Naran Institute, right?
No. Hello. Dr. Georgie is from CMS College, Cotton. CMS
Okay.
Cotton.
Yeah. Okay. I think
He's my accuracy
yesterday.
coordinator.
Okay. Last week there was a seminar
Yes,
organized
yes.
by the English Department of Sacred Heart College, Chalakudi. So I
Oh,
think someone with similar name was there.
okay.
Okay, sir. So happy to have you in this conference. I'll be here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So, Arati,
Okay, ma'am.
okay, we can start exactly at 7 o'clock, okay?
Okay. 1 more minute to go.
Yeah, one more minute to. And then the others, let them join as and when they please. Let's start punctually.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Chrysalis commemorative lecture series
Yes, please continue.
2023 to 2024. First of all, let me extend a very warm welcome to our principal, Dr. Chako Jose P., who has always supported us in all the departmental activities. Welcome, sir, to this gathering.
Thank you. Thank you.
And next, I welcome the chairperson of today's session, Dr. Joji John Panikkar, who is the assistant professor of the Department of English, CMS College, Kottayam. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And I also welcome the presenter of the day, Dr. Meera C., assistant professor, Department of English, Sacred Heart College. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
And to this gathering, I also welcome the director of our research center, Dr. Betsy Palsy, Mr. Jason Joseph, the head of the research and PG department of English, research supervisors, scholars, guides, faculty members, and all other students. Welcome, everyone. Today's talk is actually titled Print Modernity and Reading Perspectives from Kerala. And today's speaker is Dr. Meera C., who is an assistant professor at the Department of English, Sacred Hearts College, East Campus, Kochi. She actually holds a PhD in English from the Institute of English, University of Kerala, and is a visiting doctoral fellow affiliated to the University of Wisconsin, Madison, US. And she is also a recipient of the prestigious Fulbright Nehru Doctoral Research Fellowship for the year 2020 to 2021. And this session will be actually chaired by Dr. Joji John Panikkar, who is actually an assistant professor working in the Department of English, CMS College. He is a bilingual writer, critic, academician, editor, and author. He is also the joint secretary of the Guild of Indian English Writers, Editors, and Critics, and also on the editorial board of reputed journals. Hearty welcome, sir, and now the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Ardi, for the words of welcome. Respected Principal Dr. Chako Jose, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed speaker for the day, Dr. Meera, and fellow enthusiasts of knowledge. Warm good evening to everyone listening to me. I'm indeed honored to be a part of the Chrysalis deliberations organized by the Research Center in English of St. Aloysius College to commemorate the treasured contributions of the eminent teachers of the department. Let me, at the outset, thank the department and specifically my friend and inspiration, Dr. Betsy Paul, the Director of Research and the coordinator of Chrysalis, for giving me this opportunity to chair today's deliberations. Today, I'm
Thank
indeed
you, sir.
honored to chair this session to delve into the profound interplay between the the three pillars of intellectual and cultural growth, which is print modernity and the timeless art of reading, as viewed through the distinctive lens of Kerala, which is a region that has long been a cradle of intellectual ferment and cultural dynamism. You know, Kerala has a rich tapestry of history woven with the threads of intellectualism, trade, and cultural exchange. The evolution of print and the embrace of modernity have significantly shaped the intellectual landscape of this region, which actually provides a unique perspective on the transformative power of written words. Print as a medium became a catalyst for modernity in Kerala. The dissemination of knowledge through newspapers, magazines, and books enabled the masses to engage with ideas beyond their immediate surroundings. And this democratization of information played a pivotal role in shaping the intellectual consciousness of the people, fostering a sense of awareness and progressive thinking. And the embrace of modernity in Kerala was not merely technological, but it was also a philosophical one. And the state actually witnessed the confluence of traditional wisdom and contemporary thought, creating a unique amalgamation of the old and the new. And print, as the carrier of this intellectual synthesis, became a bridge between the rich heritage of Kerala and the transformative winds of change blowing through the modern world. Reading in this particular context emerges as a silent protagonist, a vehicle which transcends time and space. I'm sure today's speaker will address all these factors. The nexus of print, modernity, and reading in Kerala paints a portrait of a society deeply rooted in its heritage, yet unafraid to embrace the winds of change. That is the specialty of the Kerala scenario. Printed word has been a torchbearer of enlightenment, guiding the people through the corridors of knowledge. As we continue to navigate the complexities of the modern world, let us not forget the lessons embedded in the pages of Kerala's literary legacy, a legacy that exemplifies the harmonious coexistence of tradition and progress of print and modernity, and the enduring power of reading to transform minds and societies. As we embark on this intellectual journey, let us open our minds to the nuances and revelations that Dr. Meera is sure to share with us today. May her words inspire us to appreciate the enduring relevance of print in the face of rapid technological advancements, and to recognize the symbiotic relationship between literature and the ever changing landscape of modernity. Without further ado, let us warmly welcome Dr. Meera for the lecture titled Print, Modernity, and Reading Perspectives from Kerala. Over to you, Dr. Meera.
Thank you, sir. Respected Principal, Professor Chakujos, Chair Dr. Joji Panikar, um, Director of Research, Dr. Betsy Paul. Thank you and good evening to one and all. I feel extremely privileged that I have been given this opportunity to speak to such an erudite gathering of scholars and academics. And I must thank Dr. Betsy Paul, ma'am, for this great honor. Thank you, ma'am. I also thank Dr. Joji John Panikar for taking out the time to chair this session today and for his insightful words of introduction. Thank you, sir. So when Betsy ma'am was briefing me about this session, I was told that the aim of this lecture series is to create a discourse on upcoming research areas, different research areas. So in today's lecture, I thought I'll share some glimpses from my own doctoral research in the University of Kerala, and I hope it adds to the larger scope of this lecture series. So broadly, my research looked at reading as a cultural practice in 19th century Kerala. Its focus was on the decades that followed the coming of print in the language of Malayalam, that is from 1820s roughly up to the 1900s. And the objective of my study was to understand how reading as a practice, as an intellectual practice, but also as a material cultural practice premised on objects of reading, became centrally tied to the permeations of modernity in the region, especially in relation to the forces of evangelism and colonialism. So, when I was beginning to work on this topic, there was this dilemma of method that I faced, and it was this: how do you go about studying historical cultural practices that are quite transient? If you look at it, reading is all around you, but it is also ephemeral, fleeting. It rarely leaves traces. It takes no measures against the erosion of time, as Michel de Sade famously remarked. So, how do you trace the past of a practice like that, especially in societies like ours where archiving is not really that rigorous? I tried to address this question by focusing on writings on the practice of reading. So, my study essentially became an analysis of the discourse on reading as a practice as it entered into dialogues with the formations and ideations of modernity. Now, this discourse is quite a vast one. So, in today's lecture, I'll be talking about only one part of it, that is the Protestant missionary discourse on reading from 19th century Kerala. In particular, I'll look at how the missionary commentators legitimized a changed relationship between the reader subject and the text object as ideal for native populace. That is, a new kind of relationship different from what prevailed in Kerala. I'll suggest that this new ideation was impelled by Protestant doctrine's theological emphasis on self mediated reading. And I'll also look at how this idea of a new kind of a reader subject became central to missionary imaginations of desirable modernity for native populace. Now, a few disclaimers before I begin this paper. My training is primarily in literary studies and cultural studies. So, the arguments I place in this essay are an attempt to read a particular moment from Kerala's cultural history using the methods of cultural studies, and hence the emphasis on discourses and the cultural work of narratives around reading. Secondly, whenever I use the term modernity, I refer to a broad and fluid conception of the term, something close to what Shiju Sam Varghese and Satish Chandra Bose defined as, I quote, a phenomenon of reflexivity on the newness of times, assembled through material and discursive processes at different sites conforming to different modalities. When I talk about narratives and ideations on reading, it is presumed that this kind of an ideational work is central to modernity's enterprise because it seeks legitimacy. Modernity as a project seeks legitimacy against an extant present that is no more deemed modern, even as new imaginaries are constantly contested or accepted in a perpetual ideas. And finally, to talk about the modernity of reading as conceived by missionary writers or in general is not to suggest the emergence of a temporal rupture from previous modes, Instead, it is understood that moments of technological transition can only be understood in terms of crossovers, porosities, overlaps, and coincidences. Now, coming to my paper, it begins with a brief outline of preprint traditions in Kerala as a context and then proceeds to its core arguments. It has been argued that print became a familiar reality in Kerala with the coming of Protestant missionaries in the 19th century. Mainly so because they were the ones who commenced Malayalam printing within Kerala, within the region of Kerala. However, even prior to the coming of print, Kerala was home to a nebulous matrix of pre-print traditions. These existed in different modes, such as the oral and the scribal. Also, these belonged to different linguistic, religious, and ethnic moorings as well. Now, although we cannot generalize the nature of preprint cultures, we can see that at least some of these traditions emerged as hegemonic and insular systems over time. This was a result of the larger nature of Kerala as a gendered caste society, in which one's access to the letter, access to knowledge corpuses, and the access to spaces of reading were contoured by norms of exclusion. So, when I refer to reading, I'm also primarily referring to reading as a material cultural practice in this sense. Although reading has this whole entire side where it is an intellectual activity, a critical activity, all of those things. So when we look at preprint cultures, what we get is actually the picture of a very diverse field. On the one hand, we have highly subversive cultures of orality in the region when we look at knowledge circulation as a whole. For instance, as many scholars have noted, we have song cultures that documented caste oppression and articulated dissent. We have song cultures that captured gendered relations and resistances. At the same time, ironically, orality was also the mode through which Vedic traditions in Sanskrit were handed down. As these texts embodied the foundational tenets of Brahmanic Hinduism, these were circulated within highly insular socio-spatial terrains. These remained ritualistically closed off to castes other than Trivarnika Savarnas, that is, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas, and to women as a whole. We have dictums testifying this in Shankara Smriti, the regional code to which Malayalis or Keralites were supposed to adhere. Also, Vedas were Shrutis or texts which were allowed to be learned only through listening, and the access to these was through rigorous quasi religious training, especially in Sanskrit, prohibited to women and the people of non Brahmin castes, as the historian Bhaskar Nunni has noted. In addition to these, we also had scribal cultures. So I was talking about oral cultures in the beginning. We also had scribal cultures, manuscript cultures that flourished principally around palm leaf manuscripts of Puranas and Itihasas like the Ramayana. Now, these were open to a relatively wider community of readers that included the Shudras and the literate Savarna women. However, castes which figured below the Shudras largely remained outside of its sanctioned economies. There were dictums that prohibited these granthas or manuscripts from being circulated. One reads like this, and I quote, "The grantha shall not be given away, even if the God of gods pleads for it." End quote. This is from Vilvatatha Krishnan Nambyar. In addition, the granthas were mostly held in granthapuras or manuscript
Excuse me?
libraries. Yes? Yes, ma'am?
No, there was a disturbance, but now it's okay.
Okay. Hope I'm audible now.
Yes, now you're audible.
Okay.
There was a 1 minute disturbance, that's all.
Okay.
Please continue.
Yeah, so I was talking about the Granthapuras where these manuscripts were held or stored. These Granthas were mostly held in Granthapuras or manuscript libraries of affluent upper caste households, temples, and educational institutions. These spaces of scribal reading reinforced caste based spatial restrictions. And when it comes to education, non Vedic education was not ritualistic like Vedic education, but even then it functioned in a caste exclusive manner, as historians like P. Bhaskar Nunni have noted. Now, this analysis is not to suggest that there were no instances of negotiation or exceptions when it comes to the preprint schema. It is only to suggest that the dominant reprint cultures were largely inscribed within tenets of a caste based social structure and its patriarchal morals. So, when the technology of print came into the Malayalam speaking regions in the 1820s, it entered into this fairly sophisticated network of vernacular reading objects, a socio technological matrix of hegemonies and negotiations. And now we come to the 19th century. By the 19th century, we find that this situation was ripe for change. By then, Kerala, with its strengthened colonial presence and active missionary ventures, was a dynamic contact zone of many conceptual worlds and cultural practices. We see several cultural transformations in this age. The setting up of printing presses in Malayalam, the increased circulation of reading material from outside in cities like Madras, for instance, within Kerala, the diffusion of hitherto unfamiliar reading objects such as printed books, periodicals, tracts, and pamphlets, the rise of new spaces of reading such as schools, libraries, and reading clubs, that is, modern schools, the introduction of English education, to name a few. Each of these changes asymmetrically permeated everyday lives of people in a caste bound gendered society. Now, the Protestant missionary enterprise that found footing in Kerala in the 19th century was particularly relevant to the histories of reading in the region. When I say Protestant missions, I am mainly referring to the London Missionary Society from Travancore, the Church of England Senana Mission Society, again operational in Travancore, the Church Missionary Society, which had stations in Travancore as well as Kochi, and the Basel Evangelical Mission in Malabar. These missions entered into complex relations with local cultural formations and practices, especially reading. Now, there was one factor which was central to the revival of evangelical Protestantism in England, in the metropole, which also became crucial for the histories of reading in the zones of colonial evangelization. And that was the emphasis on the propagation of the word of the scripture. This aim was shared by the different Protestant missions that made their way into Kerala and can be seen reflected in their operations as well. The new missions that came to Kerala established communities in their zones of activity. This included Christians of non Protestant denominations such as Syrians, Romo Syrians, and Catholics. This also included people of Savarna Hindu castes, marginalized castes, Jews, as well as Muslims. Most of these demographies had specific ways of relating to the text object, both religious and non religious, which were shaped by socio-cultural determinants. And the presence of these demographies influenced missionary ideations about reading. Thus, we find that their reading and book practices became a significant locus of reform for the Protestant missionaries. Now, coming to the discourses as such, reading and book practices in Kerala were a highly debated topic throughout the missionary discourse, from Kerala. This discourse reveals complex ideations regarding native modernity at work. Looking at this discourse as a whole, it can be argued that the missionary discourse valorized a changed relationship between the reader subject and the text object, different from what was in vogue among local communities. In particular, it could be suggested that the Protestant missionary discourse conceived the ideal modern subject of Kerala exclusively as a reader subject. Also, the distinct qualities to be possessed by this reader subject were central to this discourse. Now, the roots of this missionary preoccupation with reading can be traced back to the larger theological vision of Protestant evangelism. Foregrounding the centrality of print in the rise of European Protestantism, Belinda Jack notes how the very ability to read was pivotal to Protestant theology right from its inception in Europe. It was proposed that, I quote from Belinda Jack, everyone, man and woman, had the divine right to read the Bible in their own mother tongue, without the interpretive participation of anyone else. End quote. The material technology of print remains central to this vision. As John Berger notes, I quote, Protestantism, by asserting man's direct communion with God, required a Bible cheap enough for common availability. End quote. This is the printed Bible. Thus, central to Protestant theology was the notion of a new historical subject who interacts with the scripture by oneself, preferably in print and ideally in the vernacular. When colonies in India and elsewhere became sites of missionary engagement, this emphasis on reading became a central tenet of their civilizing mission. Reading emerged as a crucial part of what missionaries envisioned to constitute modernity for colonial societies. The echoes of this could be traced in the Protestant discourse on Kerala as well. For instance, writing about Kochi in 1839, Reverend H. Harley of CMS notes, and I quote, when the blessed doctrines of the Reformation become more and more known and prized, and when the Word of God, which comprises those doctrines, is read and understood, then we trust that many will embrace the truth. Toward the promotion of this end, we are using means preaching, reading, the distribution of tracts, and the establishment of schools are the mediums through which we convey spiritual instruction to their minds, and which, under divine blessing, we hope will be conducive to their spiritual welfare. End quote. Similarly, to quote from Madras Church Missionary Records of 1859, I quote, enlightening the minds of the people by teaching the youth to read, and putting the sacred scriptures and other books of a religious and wholesome tendency to their hand, were counted among the foundational objectives of the new Protestant missions. Missionary engagement thus attempted to conceive ideal modern subjects exclusively as reader subjects, and they tried to craft individuals who are pious reader subjects. In addition to this, the need to create a people who can read, that is, a society that can read, evolved as central to the missionary imaginations of native modernity. As noted earlier, in pre colonial Kerala, the majority of marginalized social groups existed outside the ambit of indigenous reading cultures. For the evangelist project to be realized within such a social terrain, it became inevitable that a community of readers be crafted in the Malayalam speaking regions. Thus, writing about Travancore in 1811, William Ringletop of LMS notes that, I quote, it is quite in vain to print and distribute Bibles if there is none that can read them, end quote. Writing in 1834, Joseph Peat of CMS went on to attest the need to create a society that can read in Thiruvidampur. And I quote, from observation, I learned this important fact with regard to Travancore, that before you can hope you must create a reading people. For I find that even among the Brahmins and the higher class of heathen with whom I come in contact, very few can read paper books, the emphasis is mine, except with a great deal of trouble. And among the lower, only persons who can read at all are those who have been educated in our own schools. End quote. Now, one fascinating aspect of this remark is the attribution of a specific new signification to the act of reading. Plain literacy is not the only quality that makes one a modern reader anymore. A capability to engage with paper books as opposed to leaf books is equally important. This new notion of book modernity positions itself against indigenous cultures of reading premised on the palm leaf manuscript, an object that was venerated within the caste exclusive preprint schema. Thus, the ability to engage with the Grantha begins to fall out of social status and cultural value. Instead, a new notion of reading as premised on the printed object is now considered acceptable and desirable in a new modern subject. Now, this changes the equation of social mobility in Kerala. We can understand more about the missionary conception of modernity from their interactions with local communities. The Protestant ideal of a new modern native reader subject was shaped through the encounters with local book practices. In fact, it was one such encounter, especially with the Syrian Christians, that worked behind Colonel Munro's application for CMS missionaries to be sent to Kottayam, since the aim was, and I quote, to seek the reformation of the ancient Syrian church, end quote. Writing in 1839, Reverend Harley of CMS finds it a point of wonder that Syrians have, I quote, the word of God among them, but written in Syriac, a language which few among them understand, end quote. Henry Baker of the CMS similarly writes in 1839 about authorities who, I quote, do not encourage the people to read the Malayalam version of the scripture, end quote. Thus, in addition to the ability to read and to engage with printed books, the right to read by oneself and the ability to read in the vernacular were emphasized as distinct qualities to be possessed by the ideal modern subject of Kerala by the missionaries. As a result, the circulation of the scripture in the medium of print in the language of Malayalam became the cornerstone of the Protestant engagement. This resulted in the efforts at translating the scripture by CMS and Basel missions in the early parts of the 19th century. Missionaries also rendered other religious texts into Malayalam, that is, texts other than the scripture, and composed new works in the language. Mission societies distributed vernacular religious text objects in the form of books, tracts, leaflets, and pamphlets among the local populace. The missions in Kerala also felt the need to print texts of their own, leading to the establishment of the first Malayalam printing presses in the region by CMS at Kottayam in 1821, by LMS at Kollam in 1840, and by the Basel Mission at Talasheri in 1845. Within a few years, these missions went on to have local tract societies, Malayalam book societies, libraries based in colleges, as well as mission periodicals. Missionary interactions with non-Christian populace reveal equally remarkable ideations. The Grantha was often a locus of fascination for the writings in the writings of missionaries like Samuel Metier of Travancore. However, as Joseph Mullens of the LMS noted in 1854, at times the cultures of scribal reading were viewed as an impediment to the project of evangelism. 3 years later, Reverend Harley of CMS went on to censure the insular modes of scribal reading. In missionary writings, the Protestant ideal of a reader subject was posited against the caste exclusive nature of regional reading cultures. Missionary operations in this regard became focused on enabling the native populace to forge a new modern relationship with the printed mission literatures in circulation. In this, the missionary school emerged as a significant institution. Through several of these schools, marginalized castes were now inducted into cultures of literacy. The missionary engagement also involved attempts to craft a habitus of the printed object among the caste Hindu populations with which they were unfamiliar. Writing about colonial societies, Bill Ashcroft notes that, I quote, in the hands of early missionary patrons, the acquisition of literacy was seen as a mark of civilization, and being raised to a civilized state was a concomitant of, if not an absolutely necessary precondition for salvation, end quote. The missionary ideal of the modern subject, imagined as a reader subject, thus becomes complexly intertwined with the notions of religious modernity as well. The discourse on missionary schools reflects these ideations. Now, if we look at the history of schools in Kerala, Kerala was already home to a complex network of village schools prior to the 19th century. However, these schools largely abided by the caste exclusive schema of pre 19th century education. Secondly, as Robin Jeffrey has noted, I quote, though the children learned their Malayalam letters, these schools did not aim to make people literate, but intended to introduce children to aspects of life that their elders felt important. End quote. Writings on mission schools envisioned a reader subject who breaks with these vernacular modalities of reading in distinct ways. A reader who discerns meaning from the printed object of reading by oneself and comprehends it came to be rated as preferable to a reader who recalls and recites memorized words. While the aspect of cognitive comprehension could not have been absent within the scribal schema, the missionary discourse often conceived a neat distinction between scribal memorization and comprehension. Thus, H. Andrews of CMS wrote in 1860, and I quote, "It is a common thing for a child to repeat the whole of a book without a single mistake. The great desideratum is to teach them to think." End quote. George Martin, an indigenous missionary of the CMS, similarly went on to distinguish between mechanical reading and education in 1854. And I quote, "In the common native schools, nothing more is effected than the acquisition of a mechanical skill in reading and writing, and the committing to memory of certain useless, generally unmeaning lessons. And consequently, no difference is observable between the educated and the uneducated in their after conduct in life." End quote. Thus, in addition to the qualities ascribed earlier, the Protestant missionary engagement defined the ideally modern native subject as someone with the ability to comprehend what is read through self mediated reading. Looking at the missionary discourse, it could be suggested that the missionary commentators increasingly used a specific term to connote this new relationship to the text object, and that term was Vayana, literally reading in Malayalam. In doing this, they took a term that was already in usage in pre-19th century Kerala and imbued it with specific significations. Let us look how that turned out. There are two things to consider here. In a Dravidian etymological dictionary, Barrow and Amanu, the authors, trace the roots of this Dravidian Tamil term, that is Vayana, to the Prakrit term Vayana, defined as that is said or narrated. Now, this etymology hints at a definition that goes beyond self mediated reading and comprehension. Essentially, it points at practices of reading aloud or recitation, because the definition goes like that: what is said or narrated. In addition, in pre colonial Kerala, Vayana was only one among the many terms that signified a potential relationship between a text object and a reader subject. Sanskrit based terms such as Parayanam were also in vogue, literally recitation. According to Shabda Taravali, a significant dictionary in Malayalam, Parayanam denoted a range of definitions spanning from reading to more specific meanings associated with rituals, like the recitation of Vedas or the study of the Vedas. Out of these different choices, mission writings repeatedly juxtaposed the term Vayana with the new mode that was being valorized as modern and ideal. Missionary lexicography actually offers several pointers to this. The German Jesuit missionary Arno Spaderi probably acted as a precursor to later Protestant discourses. His Portuguese Malayalam dictionary, written in 1730, defined the Portuguese term leitura, an equivalent of the English term reading, as Vayana as opposed to Parayana. From there onwards, we see a series of missionary lexicographers, including Benjamin Bailey, juxtaposing the terms Vayana and Vayanakaran as Malayalam equivalents to the English terms reading and the reader. In doing this, they tied the term Vayana, something that also probably carried etymological connotations of reading aloud or recitation, with the mode of reading that was being legitimized as modern within the mission discourses, that is, reading as comprehension. One may add here that the modes of engagement that came to be bifurcated as Parayana and Vayana could have been marked by crossovers and porosities in practice. Nevertheless, Vayana became increasingly legitimized within the mission discourses as a distinct notion of reading, grounded on comprehension in this way. In missionary novels, the ability to perform codes of this modern reading emerges as a conditional ground upon which characters gain access to new institutions in the making, whether religious, domestic, or vocational. Several missionary novels of the time depicted characters who are desirably modern and acceptably Christian as strictly literate subjects. In these novels, ideal characters who are paragons of religious piety, virtue, and moral goodness are imagined exclusively as literate reader subjects, whereas those who signify undesirable religious and moral values, or those who are in need of reformation, are depicted as either non readers or averse to reading. One example is Ghadakavadam, written in 1877 by Mrs. Richard Collins, a missionary novel which emerged out of the CMS fold in Travancore. In the novel, the character of Koshi Kurian, who is the reviled murderer of a slave child, and the caricature of a Protestant believer who, I quote, had gradually gone back step by step into Syrianism. Now, this character is sketched as someone who hates reading the scripture. On the contrary, his daughter Mariam, the fictional paragon of a virtuous Protestant Christian girl, is sketched as someone who is educated in the mission school, voraciously reads religious texts, teaches her younger siblings to read, and introduces non Christian characters to the scripture. She laments at the prospect of marrying into a non Protestant family, and I quote, "Then I shall never have any time for reading, but the mother in law will call me idle and hide my books." End quote. Paulos, a Protestant Christian character who formerly belonged to the marginalized Pulaya caste, is depicted as a pious, large hearted man who forgives the murder of his grandchild by Koshi Kurian. In the novel, Paulo's morals are pinned down to his faith and his ability to read. His decision to learn to read is placed as a pivotal moment in his character development. In another novel, Joseph Mulil's Sukumari, that came out of the Basel Mission fold in Malabar in 1897, we can see similar ideations. In the novel, the protagonists Satyadasan and Sukumari are pious Christian characters who have learned to read through Basel Mission schools and have adopted religious reading as a habit in their lives. On the other hand, the novel sketches characters like Manikam as unlettered and oblivious of the significance of reading or salvation in her life. Now, this character is someone who is not converted and apparently in need of reform. The ability to read and a disposition to read religious works also emerge as the preconditions upon which women characters in these novels gain access to successful conjugality and to the institution of the modern family in the making. Desirable femininity, crafted through reading, among other things, brings female protagonists of these novels to conjugal union with devout, literate men, thus ensuring their domestic bliss founded in piety. Mariam's marriage with Matthew, a Bible reader, and Sukumari's union with Satyadasan are examples. In the missionary novels, an ability to read also emerges as a prerequisite to vocational modernity, and through that, social mobility, in a manner that defies extant caste schema. Saraswati Vijayam, written by Potheri Kunyambu in the context of Basel Mission's engagements in Malabar, is an example. The protagonist, Marathan, who originally belonged to the marginalized Cheruma caste, is forced to flee the country by upper caste men. But he escapes and returns as a judge. His name is Yeshudasan now. And after having embraced Christianity and received modern education through Basel Mission. In this transformation from Marathan to Yeshudasan, he is aided by his literacy, which he acquires from the Englishman he used to work for. The novel thus inscribes a historical moment in which social mobility based on ascriptive caste schema was beginning to be challenged against a number of transformations, to which modern literacy too was becoming significant. In each of these instances, literacy and the ability to perform codes of modern reading thus emerge as prerequisites to gain access to new institutions and ways of living in the making. That is for the characters of the novels. The missionary novels the missionary novels thus coded particular modes of reading and book practices as pivotal to the inhabitations and negotiations of modernity for historical subjects in 19th century Kerala. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meera, for the very uh, deep analysis of the Protestant missionary discourses in the Kerala context. And um, it is probably a very such a coincidence that I could chair your session, where I'm familiar with almost all the things that you were discussing in the talk. And uh, I've always been moved by the text, the Slayer's Lane,
Yes,
Khadagavadam,
sir.
by Francis Collins. And you rightly said that there is always this clash of the confluence of indigenous wisdom and the external ideologies, uh,
Yes.
especially the Protestant missionaries. They have often promoted what you call the Vayana, a critical and analytical approach to reading,
Yes.
which encourages individuals to interpret text in an independent manner. And this approach had a long lasting impact on the intellectual climate of Kerala, which fosters a culture of inquiry and a more individualist kind of reading experience. Uh,
Yes,
that
sir.
has actually created a huge impact on the society. My question, or rather, uh, just to start off the discussions, continuing your speeches, reading might have become a very transformative tool which influences individuals' perspectives, and uh, that had specific impact on the local traditions also.
Yes,
The
sir.
thought process of the um, local traditions. And you were addressing a concept called a new modern native
Yes.
reader, or a
Yes.
subject which is shaped through the encounters with local book practices. And can you elaborate on that particular point, the reader subject? Um,
The reader subject who is becoming modern at this particular juncture in history. Yes, sir, definitely. As you rightly said, the Protestant missionary engagements and the idea of a new self-mediated reading as comprehension that acts as the conception of a different kind of intellectual climate in Kerala. That is definitely true. And as you rightly said, it comes into different kinds of engagements with local traditions, local cultures of reading of both Savarna and Avarna traditions. So we can see interesting instances of this in autobiographies if you look at it. So there is this autobiography that I remember by Jakob Ramavarman, and he was a missionary from. He was a prince who turned into Christian, who converted into Christianity and turned into a missionary in association with the Basel mission. And there is one interesting instance in his autobiography where he states that he loses his faith in Hindu tradition, and he says that the Puranas, which I read until now as religious literatures, sacred literatures, now I'm able to read those as books. So I think that shows a certain kind of a transition to that modernity of the reader subject that we were talking about for a society which probably related to certain kind of textbooks. Not to say that there were no crossovers or porosities in between these. Definitely, these texts were read as literatures prior to that as well. But now it becomes possible to look certain texts or book cultures without that aura of sacredness. That I think is one way in which these different traditions come into, you know, a, a dialogue with each other, maybe. And we see in the publishing endeavors, for instance, it becomes possible now to abridge sacred texts. Now, until then, it was unthinkable, but now it becomes possible to abridge them, edit them, bring
Yeah.
summaries of them. So the idea of sacredness and the idea of the sacred book, that connotation changes. So that I think is an interesting instance of the modernity of the subject as we were talking about. But in general, I think the modern subject, the new modern subject, uh, glimpses of that were probably also there in relation to scribal cultures. But now it becomes acceptable and desirable that if you are like this, you are acceptably modern, probably. I think that is where the missionary discourses come to play a very significant role in making this acceptable, in making social mobility acceptable through literacy, for instance.
This reading practice might have actually stirred debates about the cultural assimilation and the imposition of foreign ideologies too,
Yes,
right?
that side is also there. So definitely, that side is also there, and we see resistances to this as well. For instance, again to go back to autobiographies, if we look at the autobiography of Kani Payur, he was a man from a privileged caste, and definitely for many of them, this felt as an imposition. And we find that even after the circulation of printed reading objects in Kerala, all of them hold on to a comfort and familiarity of the palm leaf manuscript. So there are portions where he says in his autobiography that we continue to read this, and that is enough. So that was the other side of it, where and even print, the assimilation into print results in standardization and the loss of variety, and all of the other side is also there. So definitely it's there.
Thank you, Mira. And the floor is now open for discussion. Your comments, please.
I invite Miss Julie Dominic, Assistant Professor, LF College, to give her comments on Dr. Meera's talk. Miss Julie?
Thank you. Thank you, Arati, for the introduction. And it was very interesting listening to Dr. Meera with a new perspective of understanding of Kerala and reading leading to modernity. As you went through the process of reading, which got a space in a very indigenous, cross-cultural context of Kerala, from the north to the south of Kerala, we have a very different kind of a terrain and a different kind of understanding of certain ideologies, which gave way to an opening of reading to common man or common group of people. So it incites how the process of reading developed from a very naive ideologies to a very strong perspective of understanding of in and around the cultural specificity of Kerala. So it is very interesting, and it gives a new insight into the development of modernity and how the Protestant missionaries influenced or gave importance to the concept of reading, which has drastically changed the reading groups today in this present scenario, and localizing the concept of the highly privileged notion of reading into a very simpler perspective has uh, grown or has made people understand how important reading is. And also the availability of books through print media is also a kind of a change which has brought in. And what we see in the present Kerala scenario, it is segregated. Reading is not segregated as it was earlier. Dr. Meera has presented a very good work, and it is definitely. It will definitely give us the thoughts about how it was deliberately brought into Kerala, the ideology of the subject and the text, and the notion of a reader. And it is giving us an inspiration to read more about what was the culture of Kerala, which has brought in such many changes, not like the other states of India. We can find a kind of cross-cultural interactions even among the indigenous groups of Kerala. And it is definitely because of the inculcation of the process of reading, which entered into the life of people during the early 18th, early 19th centuries. And presently, we have books of new literatures which also speak about a lot of changes which went through in the terrain of Kerala. So I congratulate you for quoting a lot of critiques regarding the perspective of reading, and the missionaries who developed a lot of strain in planning out to bring in how a group of intellectuals in Kerala. Definitely, they have done a great job in order to get such a wonderful present intellectuals in Kerala. So I think it is definitely an insight, and it is a very valuable and relevant presentation. So congratulations, Meera, and thank you so much for accepting our invite and giving us such a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Meera.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Ma'am, there's a question in the chat box.
Uh, yeah, there is a question in the chat box by Anjali PS. I'll read out the question. Do you think, with the arrival of Protestant missionaries, preprint traditions of dominating class and culture declined? Yes, now that's a significant question to be addressed. We would see that in certain ways there was a democratization of reading in place, in the sense that too many things happened at that point of time. Until then, books were circulated only within certain segregated social spaces, to be precise. But after that, we find that not just because of the missionary engagements, but also because of many mobilizers of print, like states, the state governments and private publishers, all of them tried to repose or transpose manuscript manuscripts into print, and try to circulate those outside those segregated spaces. And then, as we can rightly see, more and more people are inducted into cultures of literacy, and that all creates a certain kind of a democratization of literature. But does it lead to a decline of preprint cultures? What we can find is that it finds new spaces to thrive in, because if we look at the history of, I'll speak about one text, Ramayana, which was one of the most significant material of reading in the preprint culture, that continued to thrive in print in new shapes, and new traditions were added to the reading of Ramayana. Some of the activities related to the preprint object was transposed to Ramayana, like how you would split it to arrive at a reading. So all of those got transposed to print cultures in Ramayana, and it went on to become one of the most highly sold, bestsellers, so to speak, in the enterprise of print publishers like ST Redyar, for instance. So there are ways in which the preprint cultures thrive on as well, but in new ways. So that is the nature of all kinds of technological changes, I think. Aishwarya Vedula has a question. How did the linguistic and educational interventions of Protestant missionaries in Kerala influence the preservation or transformation of local languages and traditional knowledge systems within the dominant class? Yes, that is a relevant question. So my study was almost exclusively based on Malayalam reading cultures, but Kerala, as we all know, we call Kerala to be a Malayalam speaking region, but it is only the predominant language of Kerala. And there are many languages making the landscape of what is today understood to be Kerala. So we had a strong Tamil culture to the south of Travancore. And we had Arabic cultures in Malabar. So all of these local linguistic cultures, ethnic cultures were definitely there. And what we find, at least in the initial stages, is that the emphasis on vernacular came to be translated as an emphasis on Malayalam. So most of the predominant activities of the missionaries were focused on Malayalam when it comes to vernacular languages. The Bible translations, most of them were into Malayalam. There were dictionaries coming in. There were periodicals coming in, like Rajya Samajaram and Jnanadikshapam, all of them in Malayalam, Basil Mission. So, in a certain sense, Malayalam gets privileged in that whole interaction. At a later point of time, we find certain subcultures making their presence in print. For instance, in Malabar, there were Arabic print cultures coming in the beginning of the 20th century, but not before that, not to my knowledge. So I think there is a privileging of Malayalam that took place, at least in the initial stages. Thank you.
Any other questions or clarifications? It was definitely a pointer to the treasure house of the missionary literature that we have in our state. In fact, you have touched almost all the missionary records, and you have cited